We're now going to roll out a pie dough for a shell for a pie. This happens to be mealy pie dough. Generally speaking, you'll use a mealy pie dough for the bottom crust of your pies. It's not always a hard, fast rule, but for the most part, mealy doughs work best for the bottom crust. Now, when these come out of the refrigerator after they've had a chance to relax, I will generally take my dough and I'll slightly knead it, and all I'm doing is rolling it in my hand towards the front. I'm bringing the dough together to where it's not going to crack on the outside. It gives me a nice smooth surface on the outside to roll this out, and it's not going to crack any, hopefully. Then what I do is I start to disc it out, and when I disc it out, I'm pressing it down with my thumbs, and I'm keeping my fingers around the outside to kind of keep that outside edge nice and smooth and crack free. Because if you have a nice crack free dough, when you first start rolling, hopefully it won't open up any fissures or start cracking on the outside too bad. Okay, so I've dusted the table with a little bread flour. I put bread flour on the table, I put bread flour on top of the dough, and now I'm going to begin to roll this dough. To roll any type of pie dough, if you're trying to do something round, I generally take the rolling pin, I'll place it in the center, put a little bit of pressure, go forward, come back to the center where I was, and roll back. What that does is that rolls this dough out very slowly. Then I turn the dough 45 degrees or however you need to, and I do that to make sure that the dough is not sticking to the table. Once your dough starts sticking to the table, that starts causing a lot of issues that you really don't want to have to deal with. But if you keep your dough moving, you're almost assured that it's not sticking to the table. Now once it starts getting fairly big, I can feel it starting to stick just a little bit to the table. So I'm going to dust the top of the dough, spread it out, give it a nice even layer of flour. I'm going to turn this dough over, dust it a little bit more, and do my finished rolling. At this point, you may or may not be able to move it on the table, but as long as you can, I would. Once it starts to get to where it's going to crack a little bit, if you try to move it, stop moving it. But I think I can get it the rest of the way at this point without it sticking. So, to get your pie dough into a pie tin, you can just gently pick up the dough, fold it in half, place your pie tin down, lay the dough inside. Now, any cracks, any fissures that get caused when you're trying to pick up the dough, you can fix that with a little bit of water and stick a little dough in there. What I'm doing now is I'm making sure that the dough is flat up against the bottom of the pie tin. If any air bubbles get caught between the pie tin and your pie dough, as your pie bakes, what happens is that air bubble gets bigger and it pushes all of the filling towards the outside. So I'm also taking the dough and I'm pulling it down into the pie tin as opposed to trying to stretch it. If you stretch it, it'll just snap back. Now to fill any areas where you've got a cracked dough, you take a little water, put it on there, and then when I cut off the excess dough around the outside to make it nice and even, I'll have dough to use as a patching material. So what I'm doing is I'm cutting the dough that's about a ½ inch away from the edge of the pie tin, and this is going to give me enough dough on the outside to get a nice crimp on top of the pie to make it nice and pretty. Okay, so all this little bit of this extra dough, if I take this and I kind of place it into that crack, nobody's going to be the wiser, nobody will even know. Okay, so to get the pie dough up on top of the pie shell, to get that crimp on there, I'm going to take this pie dough, pick it up, and set it on the outside edge of the pie tin. And I'm going to do that all the way around the pie. Then I'm going to do a crimp on it. Now the crimp that I do is basically a 4-finger crimp. I take 2 fingers on this hand, 2 fingers on this hand. The left hand always goes forward, the right hand goes back. And I just do a nice gentle twist. Where my left hand or where my right hand was, I'm going to put my left fingers and move it and do that same action. The left one goes forward, the right one goes back, and you continue to go around the pie and you end up with a pretty nice crimp. There's lots of different ways to do a crimp. If you do a better crimp than this, that's fine. Any crimp that you do on top of the pie, that's just kind of extra decoration for the top of the pie. I've worked with people who have very small hands, so their little tucks in their crimping is actually really small. Mine is fairly large. It all depends on the size of your fingers. To store pie doughs, you can simply take your pie dough, take a quarter sheet of parchment paper, lay in your pie shell, lay this in on top. You can then wrap this, put it into the freezer, and anytime you want to make a pie, you'll have pie shells ready to go.
Hot.
Okay. Today we are going to be preparing apples to go into any type of apple desserts, whether it's an apple pie, tart tartan, any type of apple dessert. Basically, the way I peel the apples is always going to be somewhat the same. I use a paring knife and a Parisienne scoop to take out the seeds. It makes it a little bit easier. But to remove the top and the bottom, if you just turn the apple, it comes right off. Nice sharp knife. And all I'm doing is just turning the apple. If the knife is sharp, it'll cut right into the skin, go right through it very simply, or very easily. Okay, now to remove the rest of the skin off an apple, you can use an apple peeler, or you can use any type of peeler that you want. I've always found it a little bit faster and easier for me to do it with a knife. And the way I do that is basically I take the knife and I have 3 fingers on the handle. I put 1 finger on the top of the actual blade itself, and I do a method that they normally do in the kitchen when they're actually turning any type of vegetable, but that same motion you can use to actually peel apples. So I've got my thumb on the back part of the apple. As long as your knife is sharp, it'll go right through there, and that same motion that you're doing with this is the same motion that you use when you're turning potatoes, carrots, or any type of vegetable in the kitchen. And I always found it easier to have the smaller part or the thinner part of the apple at the bottom and come towards the larger part of the apple. It seems to make it easier to peel that way. You just keep peeling them down. Now, since these are Granny Smith apples, generally speaking, Granny Smith apples, they're not going to brown like a lot of the Red Delicious apples do, or some of the Delicious apples do. These will actually stay nice and white, so putting lemon juice on them at this time is not always necessary. Usually when you need the lemon juice is going to be when you start cutting into the seeds. It starts turning brown around the seeds first, and it works its way out towards the outside. But since we're making an apple pie filling today, I'm going to be cooking these pretty much so right away. They're not really going to have a chance to turn brown on us. Or if they do, that's okay, because there's cinnamon in the recipe, and that's just going to turn them brown anyway, so everything should be all right. It'll be beautiful either way. Okay. Cut all the apples in half. Now there's lots of different ways to remove the seeds. The Parisienne scoop just seems to work really well for removing the seed pod from the center of the apples. And if you're cutting any apples up for any type of apple dessert, this kind of makes the center a little bit neater also. So now that I have the seed pods removed from the center of the apples, I have to remove a little bit of the stem. So I just take my paring knife and just kind of do a simple U motion, and that will remove the top and the bottom of the apple. Some people like to do this ahead of time. It really kind of depends on how you want to do it. This seems to work best for me, but everybody's different. Everybody has their own technique. You do what you want to do. Missed that one. Now we're going to be slicing these apples up for an apple pie. When you're making any type of dessert where you're actually going to be cooking the apples like we're going to be doing today, it's always a good idea to slice the apples in a nice consistent thickness. That way they cook as evenly as they can. They're not going to have one part of the apple being really hard and the other part of the apple being very soft or not quite cooked. So to slice the apples, I like to just put them flat on the cutting board, and doing the same technique that you would do in the kitchen. If you just take the knife and keep the point down, pull the knife straight back, it doesn't move. You've got some nice slices. There you have it. All our apples nice and sliced, ready to be baked.
You're hot.
Okay, we're going to make a apple cranberry filling. It's kind of a takeoff on the recipe and straight out of the book, which is just the cooked fruit method of actually baking a pie filling. We start off with the butter in the pot, or butter in the pan, and what we want to do is we want to go ahead and melt this butter down, because we're actually going to start cooking our apples in this pan. And that was 1 ounce of butter that we put into the pan. In that 1 ounce of butter, I'll go ahead and put in my 3 ounces of sugar. And it may look a little bit dry now, but once we put the apples in, the apples are going to start giving up juice. So go ahead and put our apples into this pan. And we're going to cook these till they soften up a little bit. It'll take 2 or 3 minutes for these apples to soften and actually start to break down just a little bit. You don't need to cook them until the apples are mushy, but you do want to just kind of cook them until they start to soften up a little bit.
I did.
Okay, the apples have now been cooking for a few minutes. They've started to soften up. As you can see, there's a lot more juice than there was before. And that's just the juice coming out of the apples. The action of cooking the apples are actually starting to bring out their juice. Now I'm going to add in cranberries that have been soaked in a little bit of water. And what that does is the dried cranberries kind of rehydrate to a certain extent. That way they're not pulling out as much juice out of my filling once I get the filling made. So I need to bring this back up to a boil, and then we'll hit it with a cornstarch slurry, which is just cornstarch that has been suspended in a liquid. So cornstarch, once you get it in a cold liquid, it kind of drops to the bottom. You need to give it kind of a quick stir just to get it to be nice and suspended. And we'll go ahead and add that to our apple filling. And that should thicken up fairly quickly. As you can see, as this is mixing, it's starting to thicken up very well. Got a nice consistency to it. Once this has thickened, basically this filling is done. You can turn the heat off. The last few ingredients that go in here are going to be a little bit of lemon juice, 1/4 ounce of butter, 3.5 ounces of sugar, teaspoon of cinnamon, pinch of salt, and 1/2 teaspoon of nutmeg. Once this gets mixed all together, basically our apple filling is done, and it's ready to be cooled and then put into a pie shell that's been rolled, and then we'll put a top crust on it. To get the top crust to stick to this pie, you need to take a little bit of water and brush the outside of the pie shell with a little bit of water, and that kind of acts like glue, which kind of helps get that top crust to actually stick to your pie shell, or to your pie. So we've got that done. Go ahead and move that over. All right. Now that we have our filling nice and cool, we have our pie shell rolled. I'm going to go ahead and fill my pie and put another crust on top, since we're making a double crusted pie. When you go to put the filling in the pie, make sure that you don't get any of the filling on the actual edge where you're actually trying to seal the top crust to the bottom crust. If you do that, that will give a spot for your pie basically to start bubbling out over the side, which is not what you want. When you're filling a pie, you want it more or less level with the top of the pie plate. We're going to go ahead and roll out the top crust for our pie. We're going to be using a flaky pie dough for the top crust. Top crust should always be made from a flaky pie dough, whereas the bottom crust could be made out of a flaky or a mealy, but this one we're going to make out of a flaky pie crust. So, the rolling technique for rolling the top crust is the same as the bottom. You want to be very careful as you're rolling this out, starting in the middle and pushing forward, coming back to the middle and pushing back, keeping the dough moving on the table, making sure that there's flour on the dough itself. That way it doesn't stick to the rolling pin or stick to the table. You want to be fairly gentle with your dough. If you try to push it out too fast, sometimes it will actually start to fight you. Starting to stick to the pin a little bit more flour down. See, I'm picking up the dough once in a while just to make sure that it is not sticking to the table, because once it sticks to the table, it gives you all kinds of problems trying to pick it up, and you don't want to have that problem. Okay, so I think we've got that rolled out large enough. Our pie that we're actually going to put the top crust on, we've got water brushed around the edge. I'm going to fold this dough in half and pick it up so we can place it on top of our pie. Okay. Use your scissors to trim off any of the excess dough. Then we're going to take this dough and kind of pinch it into the top dough. Where I had a little bit of an issue here, I'm going to put a little bit of dough there. That should be okay. You want to seal this top crust onto the bottom crust very well to keep the filling from actually bubbling up over the side of the pie. And again, we'll do a nice crimping on it to get a nice seal on the top of this pie. Again, my 4-finger method. Okay, so we've got the top of the crust on our pie. There's many different things you can do for the top of the pie. You can brush it with egg wash, you can sprinkle it with cinnamon sugar, you can do all kinds of things with it. Today I'm going to use a little bit of heavy cream because the heavy cream is going to give a nice shine to the top of the crust and give it an attractive look. Okay, and then the last thing we want to do is we actually want to cut vent holes in the top of our pie. A lot of people do it in a very attractive pattern. I end up doing a fairly simple pattern, but it still looks pretty good once the pie is completely cooked. I'll go ahead and do 4 very long slits in the top of my pie, and then in between the 4 long ones I'll put a couple of short ones. And then on top, sprinkle with a little cinnamon sugar. And then this pie is going to be ready to go into the oven. The oven we have set at 450 degrees. I always put it on a sheet pan underneath the pie just in case it bubbles over the top. You basically, since the filling has already been baked, what we're looking for is to get the crust of the pie actually cooked and baked and browned and beautiful.
Put it in the oven.